Hello and welcome to Woman Up, the Desperate Art Wives podcast. I'm Susan Merrick and today I'm talking with Rose Gibbs. Rose Gibbs is an artist. She also curates, writes, organises discussions and runs the community organisation Mountford Growing Community in the estate where she lives. Welcome, Rose.
Thank you very much. Very nice to be here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you. I would love to hear a bit about what got you into art and the instigations behind your work.
Well, I mean, I think, firstly, I've been into art since I was a child. It was what I always wanted to do, and I don't think I'd ever envisaged anything different for myself. That's not to say it wasn't a difficult process for me post-school in terms of I made lots of changes. I didn't take a regular route through art college, and I ended up studying ceramic design at Central St Martin's, having kind of felt slightly frustrated at their fine art department. A couple of years after that, I had my daughter. I was quite young in a way. I think I was 24, and I just had this feeling, I think whilst I was pregnant, about something about the cycles of life, and without sounding kind of like gloomy about this, because of course I was very excited about being pregnant and having a child, I wanted to make sure I kind of like marked time in a way. And making art felt like a way of doing that. A big impetus for me making art was to try and find ways of expressing my experience of the world. That has been a major thing for me.
Excellent. That's a really powerful way to kind of come into the art world. You work a lot in collectives, especially within feminist collectives, women-only collectives, and you've written a lot about women-only spaces. Would you mind talking a bit more about that?
Yeah, so whilst I was at the Royal College of Art, I wrote a thesis. At first, I wanted my thesis to be about artworks made by women about motherhood and birth, and I looked around and I couldn't find that many examples. But anyway, one way and another, one of the other things I looked at was the percentage of women being shown or represented by galleries in London. And I was just quite gobsmacked at the disparity. You know, it was, back then, 2010, about one woman to every 3 men. And it still pretty much remains that way. And that's been one of the impetuses for me, kind of trying to figure out ways of supporting other artists, ways of bringing women together to work and support each other's creative practice. Because there seems to be a phenomenon where there are not, most art students are women, and post art college they don't. For one reason or another, it's the men that carry on being artists and the women that don't, and so. This is a combination of different things. I think it's kind of like socialised confidence. And so one of my objectives has been to set up groups that can support and facilitate the progress of other women's art practices. So one of the ways I've done this, for the last 4 years, since 2014, I and my friend Catherine Long set up a feminist peer mentoring group. We meet on a bi-monthly basis. Everyone has very busy lives, so we meet every other month, and the idea is that we share our practices with one another, and we crit each other's work. We also bring each other, if there's a particular article that we've been reading that we've really enjoyed, we bring that and share that with the group. And then more recently, we have been curating exhibitions. So Catherine and I have curated a few exhibitions. We curated a one-day exhibition in the ICA a couple of years ago, and we produced a publication with artworks made for the page and accompanying essays. And then we have curated performance night at the showroom, and more recently we've curated a show at Beaconsfield alongside a symposium. So the idea is it's a small group of about 12 to 14 artists, and we feel that it's important to have it as a closed group in order for people to kind of like build up trust and be able to have a small enough group to facilitate proper in-depth conversation. And we also try and have a kind of like a public engagement by putting on workshops and symposiums and that kind of thing. So that's one of the ways in which I've been working to kind of, both support my own practice and also hopefully to support some other artists' practices.
Excellent, thank you.
I can talk about my other collectives as well.
Yes, please.
If you want. So in 2014, I put on this discussion. First of all, I asked the Contemporary Arts Society if they'd hosted a discussion called Taking Up Space, thinking about women-only exhibitions. And they said yes. I was very pleased by that. And in fact, I wrote up the description. I invited a number of museum directors and curators and artists and an art critic, Jen Thatcher, as well, to come and speak at that. Now, as soon as the Contemporary Arts Society sent that mail out to their mailing list with details of the event, they got flooded with bookings.
Oh, wow.
So we had to kind of look around and see where actually we could hold this event to accommodate all the people that wanted to come. And Central St Martin's ended up giving us not just one but two lecture theatres, which we filled with big waiting lists. So it's obvious that there's a huge amount of interest in kind of working out why it is that women are not showing.
Yeah.
When clearly they're kind of there's lots of talent out there. So I did that discussion, which was really fantastic. And if you want to watch it, you can find it on YouTube.
Yes, please. Thank you, Rose.
And then
we can put the link underneath the podcast as well.
Oh yeah, okay. And so after that, a student got in touch with me, Sophia Landstrom, and we started chatting about women's collectives. One of the things that I had been interested in terms of women exhibitions, as far as my research has gone, all the work that was done in the 70s was kind of completely amazing, because it actually, for what, there can be a whole number of ideological criticisms of women-only exhibitions as them being pigeonholing, of categorising diverse practices under this kind of like very generic umbrella. However, for me as an artist, it's one really good way of seeing work that was made in the 70s, and for that reason I feel very grateful for those exhibitions, because without them all that work would have been lost and we wouldn't really know about it. So Sophia and I started looking into women's art collectives. Actually, in the first place, we're interested in separatist art collectives, contemporary separatist art collectives. Separatist as a way of having a space for women where feminism is not contested, where the point of departure is the woman's perspective, and from there kind of go on to have kind of like deeper conversations about equality, about women's expression of their own experiences. So it was interesting. It was an interesting moment, and so that was back in 2014. And my way of conducting this research was to start speaking to people about it. Asking, do you know any women's art collectives? Do you know any separatist women's art collectives?
Yeah. And
what was incredibly interesting was the fact that so few people did, and also the fact that everyone was actually really shocked. People were fairly appalled by this notion of a separatist art collective. I think that has changed. I think in the 4 years since then, things have changed. I think that now the idea of women-only spaces are way more accepted. They're seen as necessary, not the only thing that we need, but definitely a really important place that for women to gather in a space where they feel trust, and in a space where they can really have discussions without having to go over the basics, so to speak. Anyway, so this this research into contemporary separatist spaces actually led us to spending a lot of time looking at archives in the Women's Art Library and tracing the different women's art collectives of the 70s. And what is really interesting to see in those collectives is actually just how radical 70s feminists are. There's a lot of criticism about them having kind of middle-class concerns, being white and middle-class. And actually, if you look at what they're doing, and if you look at what they did, and if you look at the way in which they're operating, where they're trying to avoid institutions and set up alternatives, it's really clear that they're far from being... They're way more radical than this contemporary wave of feminism, which seems kind of directed towards women climbing the corporate structure.
It was interesting. I spoke to Sue Richardson on an earlier podcast, and we had a really good discussion about using different forms of art in the 70s and looking for different ways of practicing. And she talked about it. They weren't necessarily, or herself, she wasn't necessarily looking for a new radical way of doing things. She was just pragmatically needing a radical way of doing things because they weren't being accepted into those institutions. And we talked about Kate Walker standing up at a conference and saying, I can't be the only person who's thinking this. Why we don't just need to try and get into these spaces which actually are very patriarchal. Why don't we look at doing things differently and a way that works for us as women? And from that grew the Postal Art event that then lasted for a couple of years. But Sue as well talks about the difficulty in trying more later years. So in the last 10 years, she's loving that her work is being recognised now and getting out again. But still, she finds that it's only happening for certain, to commemorate certain things. So if it's, for example, last year was to commemorate the 100 years of suffrage for some women, and she said she just feels like, is it going to be another 100 years before our work comes out again? Is there a way of using the collectives, which I agree are really important and really necessary still? Is there a way of using that to look at work that's not just categorised as being female or women, but that also looks at the other themes, the other context behind the work, which is as valuable as the fact that it's work by women and by feminists.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in terms of what you were saying, them making up, the women in the 70s making other structures, I think the Women's Free Art Alliance is a really good example. They had their exhibition Sweet 16 and never been shown, and for that they invited any person that identified as an artist, as a woman artist, to exhibit their work, and that removes lots of the usual barriers to barriers to access, and it's interesting because then there's the shows of 78 or 79 at the ICA, and you can kind of. So there was a show at the ICA of Alan Jones's work, and of course that provoked lots of outrage and lots of protests. And Sandy Nairn at the ICA said, "Okay, well, if you women want to show bring us show us the artist, and we'll see if we think they're good enough," kind of thing. So the Women's Artist Collective, they took on this challenge of finding artists to show at the ICA, and this was the first of a series of 3 exhibitions at the ICA, and in some ways this was seen as a betrayal of what had been the feminist way of doing things, which was to do things outside of institutions and in their own spaces, and to kind of break down the usual kind of hierarchies. Anyway, so they put on these 3 exhibitions, which again I think we can be grateful for, because they kind of there, and we can look and we can go back and visit them, whereas the other stuff you have to search a bit harder for.
That can be the difficulty, I think, can't it, for for women artists that have been around, have been making work and doing this, but if they've been doing things in a different way, has it been archived? Is it available? I mean, we know from the Women's Arts Library where we're based today, there's a huge amount archived, but there must be a lot elsewhere as well that we haven't seen or isn't being shown or talked about.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. I'm really interested in the Mountford growing community. The project that you've been running the last few years, Rose. Could you tell me more about that, please?
Yeah, so the Mountford growing community, what happened was that I got a note through my door from Mustafa and Vic saying who in the community wanted to transform one of our car parks. We've got an estate with quite a few different car parks which are all very underused. Who in the estate wanted to transform that car park into a garden? And I immediately wrote back saying, yes, me, I'd love to. No, I think that note came through my door in 2015 or something like that. And I wrote back and I heard nothing back. And in 2016, so this is a year on from our new Tory government being voted back in, which I have to say I would not have expected. And I live in Hackney, so what can I say? I'm probably very out of touch with the rest of the UK. Then we had the referendum. And there was something about that, the feeling, it just reinforced how disenfranchised everyone must be feeling. And, I haven't really a clue how to encourage people to be more engaged politically and to make people feel like they can have power and they can have access to power and kind of provide them with access to power. And so I guess I started the Mountford growing community on the very kind of like basic level of thinking this is a really straightforward, simple way of facilitating the community's autonomy, the community to have greater autonomy over their immediate environment. And so I put together, we've kind of like won a number of different grants, and with those grants we've started a community garden, which has been amazing because, in my grant applications I was writing all these kind of like grand things about how it was going to bring people together and how it was going to be really good for everyone's health and how it was going to reduce social isolation and all those kinds of things. Thinking, well, I might do some of that, but probably, it will just kind of touch it. But in fact, it's been completely amazing. It's completely kind of transformed things and set up all sorts of conversations and seed swaps within the estate, which I never would have expected. And I get emails from strangers saying how much it's improved their walk to work and all sorts of things like that. And I heard on Wednesday that I've got the grant for the next part of this project, which is a 3-strand after-school club, which will have 2 physical strands for the boys and girls on the estate, which will feed and inform a 3rd strand, which is a design strand, which will be run by some architects who run portfolio building and design workshops in schools across London. They'll be redesigning the public spaces within the estate together and presenting those design proposals to the residents and the council, and hopefully going through the applications to realise those designs. And then the other part of the project at the moment has been a community cookbook, which has been a different way of engaging with those people who weren't necessarily involved in the garden. We're going to be... That's just having its final edits at the moment, and we're going to be having a launch for it shortly.
That's fantastic. It's a really clear example of how art and artists can think in different ways, potentially, of how to bring about community groups and to bring people together. I think it's especially in a time, as you say, that's quite turbulent. when you don't, and we don't necessarily have community hubs. If you're not religious, if you don't, or if you're not part of a school, maybe you know, how do you come together as a community in groups? And I think something like a shared space like that is really fantastic and simple way of doing that, and broaching everybody on different generational levels as well.
Yeah, what I found funny, actually, so I emailed my various TRA members for ages saying, who wants to start this community garden with me, kind of thing. And eventually someone got back to me and said, oh, you know, come over, and, you know, a neighbour I'd never met said, come over and have a tea and let's talk about it. So I went over to have a tea with her, and, you know, and as it turned out, she was an artist, and the other neighbour that had also turned up was also an artist.
Oh, interesting.
And it, you know, without their help, I wouldn't have been able to set the organisation up. They've since left our estate, but it just I kind of thought, in some ways, the fact that they're artists doesn't surprise me, because there's something, you know, artists are willing to or do, you know, they're self-initiating people. You know, they get things going, and they don't ask for anyone's permission to do so, kind of thing.
Yeah. And it's interesting, the link that was made between autonomy and people feeling potentially powerless. I spoke to somebody at the Social Arts Summit recently who was very much talking about choice and control, and that the NHS are really looking at how if people have more choices and have more control over those choices, we all feel that we have more control over our lives, and we feel healthier, and our mental health is healthier when we have more choice, and we can make more choices. So and that is across the board. So I think, like community spaces where it's communities, you know, and you know, like yourselves, the people who are living there, who are making the decisions about those spaces, rather than anybody else coming in from above deciding it.
So another thing that happened before the elections in 2015, I had been invited to go and speak to some sixth form college kids about feminism primarily. And anyway, as part of this discussion, there was a panel, there was various talks and a panel discussion at the end. I think the question came up about the election, and one of my fellow panellists said, well, you know, if I were you, I wouldn't bother voting. And I was just kind of completely shocked. I was like, how can you be saying this? These are teenage kids. You need to make them feel like they can have some impact, and they can have some impact on the world, even if by only voting. And so I think it's really key to make people feel like they can have some positive effects and engaged with politics and themselves. So one of the things with this after school club is to hope to sort of like install that feeling, or kind of facilitate the young kids on the estate having some engaging with our community, engaging with the political system as well. And just down the road from us, we have a after school club, which sadly has now been knocked down. And we all know that with austerity, loads of the youth centres have been closed down, and this really matters, and it really matters for young kids in London. And we all know, you know, the number of young people who've been killed, you know, over the last year is appalling, and it has to be something to do with the lack of options for them in terms of youth centres. And so one of my one of the reasons I was kind of keen to set this after school club up was as a way, a very small way, I see, to kind of give the kids some positive ways to engage.
Absolutely. Somebody else we spoke to on the podcast, Hibbo Wader, was talking very similarly about the lack of after-school clubs being a huge affecting factor on what children are doing, but also on their own aspirations. If their education and their social time around that is limited, then they look for things elsewhere, and it can be problematic.
One of the things is we're really lucky. There's a great guy on my estate called Wakita, and he's been running voluntarily fitness classes with the younger kids on the estate.
Brilliant.
So one of the good things about this grant is that now we'll be able to kind of actually support that work, because it's those kinds of people who have a huge kind of like assets in community, and our governments need to be much better at supporting those and recognising and supporting them. I think they make the difference. But another thing to say about the community garden, which has been really lovely, is a lot of the people on my estate have poor English language skills. And one of the things I found with the gardening is it's a really good way for people to socialise in a non-verbal in a setting where language doesn't predominate, where we can communicate through actions and through doing things together. And this is really important for people who can find themselves isolated because they don't have English language skills. So that's been another kind of like upside of the garden is kind of facilitating other kind of ways of being a community, if that makes sense.
It really does, and I think that's an excellent point to end on. Thank you so much, Rose.
Thanks.
And thank you for coming to talk to us.
Pleasure.
Thank you for listening. This was Woman Up, a podcast series by Desperate Art Wives.